We have professional educators that have spent their entire career trying to figure this out, trying to figure out how to inform instruction in the classroom the best way possible, what tests to use, how that accountability system plays a role in that. Dee had some great slides. We're going to make these slides available. Our next speaker is, I'm honored to introduce, is from the Texas Education Agency. Tyson Kane is the Associate Commissioner of Strategy and Analytics. He oversees the Texas Student Assessment Program and supports strategic initiatives and executive decision-making across the Office of School Programs. Previously, Mr. Kane was head of schools at the Noble Network in Chicago, where he oversaw the performance, operation, and direction of Noble's 18 campuses serving over 12,000 students. Tyson has the honor today to talk about the redesign of the STAAR as it moves to online and some new testing questions and how it'll impact our schools, teachers, and students. This is probably the most pressing thing out there right now for a lot of folks listening and in here. This is what impacts our kids the most. This is what impacts parents the most. And this is what feeds into our accountability system. So we're really happy that he came to talk about the redesign of the STAAR with us. So Tyson Kane.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to talk to you about changes coming to the STAAR test. But I don't want to start out talking about STAAR. I actually want to start out talking about what is going on today in schools, which I think we'd all agree is pretty unprecedented. We have a situation as a result of this pandemic where arguably students have the greatest possible need that we have ever seen. And in addition, our teachers and schools are stretched and staffing is difficult, every day is difficult. And so I want to acknowledge the fact that there are a lot of things going on that are unique. And I think as you all have seen the data over the last several years, student achievement has been difficult already, and I think has become more difficult, certainly as a result of the pandemic. And we've been talking a while about accelerating learning, people going into the year saying we have to accelerate learning to catch students back up, to be able to provide them the supports they need to be able to be successful. And with these needs, there are some needs that can also help be met with alignment to make sure that we can align their learning in an accelerated way that puts them best in a position to be able to be successful. And I would say that, given the difficulties of what's going on now, it's now is never more relevant than to have that conversation. And specifically when it comes to testing, some changes are coming to help improve that academic alignment. If you're like me and you were ever a teacher, as a teacher, sometimes you would note or you would see that folks would use multiple choice assessments in a class as a way to teach. And I think we'd all agree that that's not a good idea. It leads to learning that is not pervasive, is not deep, and does not stay with students in a way that actually causes them to be successful in the long term. Strong instruction has to do with gaining deep knowledge and understanding of a concept, has to do with the ability to communicate your own understanding to other people, and not just react to options that are coming your way. And in some ways, folks will use a state summative assessment to be able to drive their classroom instruction in a multiple choice format. And I would be here to tell you, that's a bad idea. That is not an instructional practice that should happen. And so there's opportunities for the state assessment to be aligned to engage students more deeply. And hence, I'm excited to talk to you about the STAAR redesign that covers some of these concepts today. First, let's talk about the existing STAAR test. The STAAR test is valid and it is reliable. It has been measured multiple times. This thing is battle tested. The legislature has made sure that there are multiple frequent issuances of reviews from outside parties to ensure on the one hand that the test is aligned and on grade level with regard to the TEKS, which obviously are the standards that we're intended to measure. And then similarly that we have the right criteria to be able to ensure those measurements are the case. This is not new. There's a lot that goes into building a test that ensures that the right measurements of the TEKs are included and that it is both valid and reliable, and the existing STAAR tests and its design have proven to be so. But our recent legislature created House Bill 3906 in 2019. And House Bill 3906's goal in this sense was to be able to kind of create some really transformative changes to the test design. And I think our legislature had the foresight to be able to do this because in many ways it allows us the flexibility in the test design to be able to create this increased alignment and engagement for students to have the test become more familiar to kids in the sense that what they're doing in the classroom every day as far as the types of cognitive tasks they're involved in would translate directly into what they're expected to demonstrate in the same ways they are demonstrating it in the classroom. You can see that some of the changes involve a 75% multiple choice cap, that is new item types, which we'll have a chance to talk about. Obviously a transition to fully online testing. That full online testing transition is one that a lot of districts have already made the transition to. A high percentage of districts on this past EOC, over 85% by the way, have tested online successfully in this last EOC that we saw in December. We were looking at a through-year assessment pilot, which we'll talk more about, to be able to take a look at what does it mean to have multiple assessment windows throughout the course of the year. And then obviously the doubling down of interim and formative assessments that the legislature believes is very strongly important for students to be able to learn. These things combine to create assessments that are engaging students in the same ways as I mentioned that they cognitively perform those tasks within their classrooms. One note on the differences between types of tests. So STAAR is a summative assessment. And summative assessments are very good for some things and they are not good for others. And I want to make that distinction very clear. So summative assessments are really good for determining mastery of a breadth of skills. That is a wide array of skills altogether. However, summative assessments are not very good for going and trying to assess whether or not a single student expectation was mastered. So if you look at a summative assessment and it's got one question about how a student, is able to add fractions, for instance, and they miss that question, it would not be a good conclusion to go away and say, well, we should be reteaching all of teaching fractions over and over again because of the one question that we saw that folks had on a summative assessment. The summative assessment is a measure of a breadth of standards. The way that you measure an individual standard is through your formative assessment tools that you use in the classroom, right? As a teacher, a good teacher will know to make sure that they are keeping up with their students' progress along individual student expectations. And when they find that to be the case, they would want to have various ways demonstrated to see the student's ability with regard to adding fractions. What's the source of that misunderstanding? How can I correct it? In what ways can it inform my instruction going forward? They're also very good to determine effectiveness of curriculum once it is taught. That means at the end of the unit or at the end of the overall instruction. Why? Because of a large breadth of standards being included, if I were to take a test before I knew the content, clearly the things I don't know yet, I'm not going to do so well on. But if I've had the opportunity to learn them and I've had the opportunity to make sure that I have that understanding, then it's a better demonstration of that knowledge once it's at the end of the sequence. It's also very good for determining which students need individual supports. That is to say, if I'm looking across my entire student body and I can see certain students performing at certain levels, that intervention is massively valuable to them to be able to help support them in their journey. And then it is an alignment and rigor bar. It is a demonstration of understanding and knowledge for how the TEKs can be demonstrated in practice and serves as an alignment method for the rigor level of what students are expected to know. Because the process of building a STAAR involves Texas teachers and involves range finding. It involves folks saying, I'm a teacher at a third grade level, I teach math. And to my students should be able to demonstrate this particular capability in my classroom. That information is used in the item development process for STAAR. So where do summative assessments lie in this overall world of assessments? I think this is a really important concept to understand. So summative that we already covered are here at the bottom, which is a measure of broad student understanding. But other assessments have other roles in testing when it comes to a suite of assessments that teachers who do effective instruction need to use. We administer diagnostic assessments at the outset to have an understanding of where our students are at and how we can best support them. We obviously go into formative assessments, which give us greater depth in a particular set of standards or a smaller window of standards. And we can go very deep on those because those instructionally are ways to be able to continue to understand how our students are progressing and in what ways. And then we have interim assessments, which, by the way, I think approximately 60% of districts across the state now, they're optional, offered here at the agency. For folks' availability, they are free. They're locked in as a result of House Bill 3906. And folks use those with great frequency as a dipstick, right, of progress for students along the way. And I would additionally say, it does not make sense to use interims 4 or 5 times a year. You know, an interim assessment is good for maybe 1 time, max 2, right? Just to be able to see, like, at mid-year, how are we doing, totally optionally for my students across a breadth of standards as they continue in their journey to be able to have an understanding across all the TEKS throughout the year. It is very important to use an assessment for the purposes of which it is intended, because the design is very important to inform those as well. And really, it does take a suite of assessments for effective learning when it comes to understanding the use and then understanding how it can best impact students. Okay, so let's talk about STAAR redesign, and let's talk about students teachers in effective classrooms. So I think you'd agree, on the left you see here a bunch of effective practices that are had by teachers. First off, they are building students' background and knowledge in all subject areas, not just kind of reading passages on disjointed topics. Secondly, you see that they're writing about what they read. To have understanding about a concept, it is very important to communicate that understanding to other people. I will tell you, this is the modern workplace, right? If you graduate with all this knowledge and you can't explain it to someone else or relay it to someone else, then an education is probably still beyond your reach. That communication of understanding is crucial, and writing has a very much reinforcing method to be able to understand what we read. So not just reading without writing. Providing many different kinds of open-ended formats, not just multiple choice. We covered that earlier on about how that repetition and exercise is something that is in effective classrooms, provide the open-ended opportunities. And then supporting the learning students in need through appropriate accommodations, that is so that all students can access information in the way that they most need, especially those students who have formalized plans, and not requiring them to perform without appropriate supports. So what's the STAAR redesign doing with regard to those great practices? This is about aligning classroom practice to increase engagement for students, as I mentioned before. So as you can see at the top, background knowledge and vocabulary are in all subject areas. While there are passages in the STAAR that are chosen, those are now going to be prioritized to be cross-curricular in the sense that they can pull from other TEKS that are understood and learned in that grade level or earlier and brought into the passages that students are reading. Writing more about what they see in texts. You may have heard Dee talk about the fact that the ESSER requirement is that there is writing in all grade levels. And that writing requirement in all grade levels, of course, is something that we're putting into all the RLA texts, but not just the writing factor in all grade levels, but also ensuring that there are writing in response to text. We'll cover that too. The open-ended question formats, we talked about the new items that are going to be beyond just multiple choice, which we'll see soon. And then appropriate accommodations. The move to online assessments creates a massively robust set of accommodations online that allow students to be able to access many of the needed supports that they administer with. By the way, many of districts who have been administering online have been taking advantage of these for a while. They improve every year based on feedback from our educators and specifically from our working groups who use these on a daily basis in their classrooms. Finally, all the assessments moving online means faster reporting of results. It also means a situation where you have less kind of the security issues that you end up with. If you think about the testing administration, you got lock and key and a bunch of papers, and you got to put them in the thing, and nobody can see them and fold them up, and there's a whole series of events that administratively is really taxing when it comes to shipping all of these items that can be solved through an exercise that is just online. Well, there's a lot of benefit there in terms of the speed and the turnaround for those. Okay, let's talk about background knowledge for just a second. Let's talk about a bit of a study. So back in 1988, you have researchers who actually looked to study the science of reading. By the way, reading is probably the most cognitively studied process that humans actually learn and acquire. It is complex, it is difficult, and it is well studied. And in this particular study, they went ahead and took a bunch of kids and they said, hey, I'd like you to recreate a situation on a baseball field based on a passage that you are about to read. So you're going to hand them the story, they're going to read it, and they're going to go recreate the situation out on the field. By the way, here's the passage they read. So I'd like you to take about 30 seconds to read that passage. All right. Who did a good job? Folks who are strong readers, folks who knew a lot about baseball, or it didn't really matter. With all the masks on, it's a little hard to hear. But B, kids with good knowledge of baseball, as it turns out, were the folks who did the best. Take this example. Take 30 seconds, go ahead and read this passage. Raise your hand if you would say that you're a good reader, just in general. Like, I'm a good reader. I thought so too. And I read this and I thought it was a funny joke, right? As it turns out, we have more than a few folks who, from India at the agency say, oh, this is very clearly a passage about cricket. And you ask any third grader in India what's going on here, and they're going to be just fine. It turns out that language comprehension and decoding together equal reading understanding. So these are, by the way, multiplied by each other. So let's be really clear. You have to be able to decode. Parents of young children, especially through this last pandemic, I have great sympathy for you. I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. It's a circus at the house and has been for some time. But I can tell you I have a firsthand understanding of the process of teaching someone how to decode with regard to knowing what letters and sounds are represented by those letters to be able to learn new words that are unfamiliar. And you have to have that as a foundational piece to be able to start to learn words and what those representations are. But then you got to have something else, which is what we just covered here with regards to baseball knowledge. Because I could have the best decoders who can tell you what every single word is pronounced to be, but they can't tell you what they mean. And they look at those words and they say, I think it's cricket. And content knowledge, which we teach in schools and must teach in schools deeply so that students can access the information, equals the ability to learn. And if you were to put multiples in front of each of these, by the way, you notice it's multiplied together. So I can't just have one and not the other, because something multiplied by 0 is going to be 0. If I can decode, but I can't understand what I'm reading, forget it. And if I have all the knowledge in the world, but I see a new word that I've never recognized and I can't decode what it is, then I'm not going to be able to read. These two things have to come together, and this is the results of the study that we just covered. What you'll notice is that at the bottom, you got low reading skills and low knowledge, right? In the middle, you got high reading skills and low knowledge. This is a student who is very well educated about how to read, but doesn't necessarily know a lot about the world. I worked for years in schools that were high poverty. I worked in South Los Angeles, worked on the South Side of Chicago. When I come here today, I can tell you that many times I sat with my students and we'd be reading a passage, and we were reading a passage one time about vacations. And we got to the end and students were able to pronounce all the words and everything. I leaned over to one of the students, I said, "What's the passage about?" And the student turned to me and he said, by the way, this is 8th graders. The student turned to me and he said, "What's a vacation?" Never taken one before. So important to be able to get the background knowledge for our students to be able to comprehend and be successful. As you can see, low reading skills and high knowledge. This is more often our dyslexic students. Yeah, students who maybe have a lot of knowledge but have real trouble with the decoding process. And then finally, high reading skills and high knowledge up at the top. This sequence tells us that both things must come together to be able to teach and understand when it comes to reading. And let's talk about that sequence since we're talking about teaching vocabulary across different subjects. I'm gonna bring it back to STAAR in just a second. Let's take a look at two different fourth graders. So here's the first fourth grader. They start out in ELA class. It's a great day. I get to learn a little bit about a giant, nautical adventures of a sailor that's also a giant. On grade level, great experience. In science, I'm learning about the sun as a source of energy. Also good, very relevant, addressing the teaks. Social studies, I'm learning about Battle of the Alamo. I've learned a lot of different things today. There's only one problem. These things are pretty disjointed. There's a continuity of vocabulary and thematic knowledge that from a depth of content knowledge perspective becomes more difficult, right, when it comes to this sequence of events. Let's take student number 2. First off, they go into their ELA class. They're gonna write a lesson that explains the characteristics of Earth layer as part of the geology unit. So great exercise in writing. Then they're gonna head to science class. They're gonna learn about weathering, describing changes in the Earth's surface. Clearly, they're gonna be making content-based connections, and they can go even deeper in their social studies class and discuss the terrain and adaptations made by Native Americans to navigate the land. In this particular classroom, this student is building deep background knowledge through a series of consistent understandings that are reinforced in that vocabulary. These are two experiences that we could relate to. As teachers, we've seen this happen, or as students, we've even had this happen with us, that it is so important for us to be connecting those pieces to background knowledge. This is why we say in great classrooms, we've got background knowledge and vocabulary that is being taught to students to be able to have them access. This is why this is so core to reading ability. And this is why there's a prioritization of cross-curricular knowledge in the passages for the STAAR. Let's talk about what that means. First off, passages already have to meet STAAR's rigorous assessment criteria. So we're talking about high quality writing, considered exemplary. We're talking about reliable and accurate and valid information that's statistically measured. We're talking about not being biased toward groups. We're talking about focus groups of teachers coming together, reading the passages, approving them, choosing them, saying these are the right passages for my students to read at the intended grade level, and then contain enough content. This is an excerpt from a 5th grade passage, is a new one. By the way, these materials will be coming up available. They'll be on our website at the end of this month. So we'll talk about that in just a second. This is a passage on the cholla cactus. Now I don't know much about cholla cactuses. I don't know about you, maybe you do. I don't really have much of a clue. But with regard to this, you'll notice that embedded in this passage are teaks, and it's a 5th grade passage, which means 5th grade or 4th grade, right? Also relevant to be able to include. You'll notice cholla stems are more rainwater absorbed through the plant's root system. Well, I don't know about cholla cactuses, but I know about systems of plants. That knowledge is now helpful for me when it comes to comprehension of the text. Similarly, bighorn gets water by eating moist insides of the cholla. I don't know much about the cholla, but I certainly know about bighorn sheep. I've heard of those before. Makes sense to me that they would use a horn to be able to obtain these things. This knowledge and understanding that we gain in other elements of our instructional experience can be brought to bear with the cross-curricular nature of the work. Not assessing science, to be clear. The passage still assesses the RLA teaks, and in a way that very clearly says, using text evidence to support an appropriate response in this case. And you can see this is actually one of the multiple select new item types, which we'll cover in a second. But it's talking about picking out multiple parts of the passage that actually indicate what that passage is saying. Okay, writing about what we read in our text. There's 2 goals for this. One is having students write in all grade levels, not just because it's great instructional practices, not just because it's required by ESSER, but because it is also great instructional practice. And 2, writing using evidence from texts that we're actually reading. You have to kind of do all the things. We talked a little bit about why it's so important to incorporate these things together, but I'll name, first off, really most importantly is bullet number 1, is that writing about what you read helps you understand. If you were ever a teacher, and you studied something in school, and then you went to go teach the thing, when did you actually learn the material? For many of us, the time we taught it was for the first time we really deeply understood it. We said, now I get it. Because I was forced to create that understanding in my own head and then communicate it to other people on a daily basis. It is a fabulous way to ensure that that communication hits home. Grounding the discussion in text we know is really important, and then supporting that knowledge building in content-rich texts and ensuring that they overlap for reasons that we've described. So let's talk about writing and speaking in text. I got 2 prompts for you. Here's the top one. Personal knowledge and experience. What is your favorite place that you've traveled to? What did it look like? And what was your favorite part? I got another one. Read 2 articles about 2 different locations. Use evidence from the articles to write a summary of the advantages and disadvantages of each location and your recommendation on which to visit. Which of these is more like what you have to do in your life as an adult? Most would say the second one. I don't know about a lot of folks. I have not been asked recently about like a thought on where I would like to travel to, certainly not in my professional life. And it's not to say that creative writing is not a good thing. We absolutely have to include that as incorporate as part of our ability to understand and create and make these things and think differently about the world. But it's also very important as a leveler to ensure that when we have the text that we can receive and write from evidence from that text, this is which prompt relies less on school-based instruction outside of school experiences. This is the equity discussion we were just having with regard to content knowledge. And you can see that previously, this includes the writing on RLA texts. Previously, we asked students about a writing prompt, and this is an old STAAR test. This is the 4 and 7 grade prompt. You can see on the other side, it says, Thomas Edison is famous for inventing things, including the light bulb. Then it says, think about inventions you believe are useful and write about an invention. You're not writing about Thomas Edison. This is about a prompt to just be able to get the juices flowing, but then write creatively about an invention you've had. But this is more like the first prompt that we just saw, which is highly contingent on your experience with inventions. And if you're like my kids, they tinker with stuff all the time. I'm giving them those opportunities. They're going to do well on something like this because we think about inventions all the time in my house, but that's not the case in a lot of places. And it's important to ensure this is based on our research and based on all the stakeholder feedback that in the redesign, we've got all grade levels with the opportunity to write and use evidence from the text. And here you see this is the spelling test. The spelling test goes longer than this. It's a play. And on the side says, based on the information in the play, write a response to how Herbie's behavior changes and how this is developed by the playwright. Using evidence directly from the text that's provided to be able to ensure that students have the ability to access, comprehend, and then be able to deliver their understanding. Okay, again, aligning to effective classrooms on number 3, we've got open-ended formats for new sorts of questions. We talked about multiple choice a little bit before. Let's talk about some of the new question types. Here's a classroom where students are asked to engage and express their understanding in modeling a decomposition in math class. So this decomposition is a grade 4 math TEKS. This is something where students are presenting and have to kind of create from nothing. Yeah, there's no multiple choice here. There's just a blank. I'm going to write out the things. I'm going to create the understanding. And by the way, when students create from scratch, as a teacher, you certainly know, that is very, very good to be able to see sources of student misunderstanding. Right? If I'm not completing the activity in full, I can see where the breakdown is. I know exactly what parts we're having the difficulty with, in what ways, those sorts of things. Very similar to my daily experience in the classroom that I'm receiving is going to be a very similar experience to what I'm going to end up then seeing on STAAR. Let's talk about RLA. So here's RLA TEKS. This is talking about bills to pay. This is about the Stamp Act, French and Indian War. Looking at the two, we're asking about folks to be able to write an essay. Cause and effect paragraph, the French and Indian War led to the Stamp Act and colonial protests. Again, I'm using evidence from the text. I'm going to write that out. Very similar to what I'd be expected to do in my own classroom, and in a way that aligns to the material that I've received here. And in my writing, by the way, we're looking at the exercise here to ensure that we've got writing in every grade level so that students can create authentic demonstrations of their knowledge based on the prompts that are created. So this is part of the non-multiple choice questions. So let's take a look at the lesson. So you see the lesson on the left-hand side. We took one example of these. This is very typically something you might see in the classroom. Students are using shaded fraction models to be able to line them in. So this is a potential new STAAR question. You see the big balloons. 2/8 of the balloons are red. 5/8 are blue. So what fraction of the balloons in the bag are either red or blue? Nothing to select, except that you have to create and be able to name it on your own with regard to what you believe that fraction is and how you would highlight and demonstrate it. Similarly, we've got a new, the lesson I might have in a class. Obviously, we talked about the Stamp Act, kind of use your own words, talk about cause and effect. Over here, we've got a new STAAR question. This is the Troya cactus again, coming back, saying, hey, look, what paragraph 7 says, why does the wood rat use the Troya cactus to build its nest? Support your answer with evidence from the article. New question that's very text-based. So the student obviously is going to fill in the entirety of that justification using the evidence from the text. Build its nest because the cactus protects it from other animals. Sharp spines of the cactus keep predators away. Thick covering also helps wood rats cool during the hot summer. Okay, so what are some of the elements of the question types that have to occur on STAAR? So this is helping to understand background of what goes into a STAAR question. First off, there's a lot of statistics from field testing. This is a process where on each of the tests, not all of the questions are actually part of the test. Some of the questions on every test are questions that are being trialed themselves. And those questions are called field tests. They go on there and folks actually fill in the responses to those, and the data from those comes back. The reason why we look at the data from those is to ensure that the question is not biased in some way, that certain student groups are only doing well on it versus others, that there's some sort of difference that was not anticipated in the question design itself. That's the field testing process. Clearly, all the questions need to align with the TEKS. They need to be on grade level. They need to make sure that they're accessible for students, lack bias, and have approval of educators. You can see on the right that there is a very robust item development process when it comes to STAAR. It heavily involves educators. Educators often write some of the questions. Educators see every single question. Educators review and approve the questions. And they also set the cut points for what determines, especially on the writing side, what is appropriate for educators or not. Students also participate too. Certainly in this last cycle, hundreds of students are involved with going through the questions themselves, talking out loud when they're doing the questions. Those are called cognitive labs. They're actually going through the exercise, and then they rate the question afterwards. And they say, well, here's what I thought about this. Here's what I thought about that. Here's the ways in which we provide the input. And then the reception to the new item types has been very strong with educators. Folks strongly believe that these new question types are more engaging and aligned to the way that they're doing the assessments in their classroom. Okay, finally, the assessment accommodations. Strong teachers do great accommodations in their classroom. These are just some, certainly not a full list of those. They get visual anchors for students who need those, pre-reading strategies, some large print, calculation aids, line readers, ability to read text aloud, transcribing to speech, and many other kinds. These are just some of those sorts of things. STAAR redesign with the online assessments. The online accommodations are very robust. I'm not sure if we have, do we have audio hooked up to the presentation that we could do? Yeah? So maybe we'll see if this short video works. This is a video of the online accommodations kind of live and happening.
Read using text-to-speech introduces the text and makes sure to cover difficult vocabulary and proper nouns so students can hear them ahead of time.
High school student Charlotte Brown competed in the Texas State Track and Field Meet in 2013, where she won 8th place in the pole vault by jumping 10 feet 6 inches high.
Passages can be expanded and text enlarged for readers who need oversized text. The line reader tool helps readers keep track of their place within the passage. Pop-ups and rollovers use images, animations, definitions, or simplified language to contextualize ideas. An online dictionary and notepad mirror the accessibility tools a student uses in the classroom. Text-to-speech is also available for questions and answer choices for students who need this accommodation.
Use soaring to new heights to answer the following question. Which sentence best expresses the main idea of paragraph 2? Option A. Brown adapted her technique as her vision worsened.
The answer eliminator allows students to cross out answer choices. Reading parts of a passage through text-to-speech allows isolated or specific information from the passage that is referenced in the question to be read aloud.
In 2014, as a junior, Brown found herself in familiar circumstances. She had made...
All right. When thinking about the accommodations process for students, this online interface is exactly what students see in the testing process. And folks say, well, gosh, by the way, I mentioned to you, a very high percentage of folks have tested online already. I'll cover that more in just a second. But in the process of testing online, some educators will say, well, my students aren't used to an online setting. We've been on paper so long. This is all very new. I don't want that to be the first time that they sit down to a STAAR test and have this problem. So several pieces of information for you and for those folks. One is that we have had an optional beginning of year assessment that hundreds of thousands of students have taken each year for the last 2 years. This is something that districts can choose into, all on this platform. So that's free, easy practice for students that is, no stakes behind it, the opportunity to bounce around in it. Similarly, the interim assessments that I mentioned before, also on the platform. So same opportunities there to be able to go in anytime, have students be able to practice with the platform, use it, be able to take tests on it, be able to see all the different functionality. And then similarly, we have a formative resource called TFAR, Texas Formative Assessment Resource. And the formative assessment resource is, again, all of these are free, by the way, to districts. The TFAR resource is the opportunity for teachers to be able to use an online resource where they can create their own assessments for classroom use. They can use any questions that they want. There's a question creation tool for some of the new item types if they want to. They can import questions from their own classroom and put them in. But they allow students to be able to take their tests and from a classroom perspective in the same online environment. So we've had teachers ask and say, well, gosh, it's really hard for me during administrations with my students who have special needs to provide them the accommodations they need on my weekly quizzes in my own classroom. So I have a solution for you. Go ahead and upload your test right into the TFAR platform and use the accommodations tools that are already in there for you. They're set, they're in the same way, and they'll allow students who need the blown up text to blow up the text on their own. They'll allow the students who need the read alouds to get the read alouds. Those accommodations are all present for them. Many opportunities for students to practice. And by the way, none of these changes are coming this spring with regard to the new test design. So the online testing is still ultimately optional. And when we think about the 22-23 is the timing for all the things that we're describing now. So we're talking about far in advance with lots of opportunities for students to become comfortable and do the assessment practice that they need in the format that they need. Finally, with the accommodations for folks who need them, you can see the large number of accessibility tools, the content-specific accessibility tools, and then the student-specific accommodations on the right. We also do Braille versions of the tests available for students and ASL. That's sign language for folks who aren't familiar. Obviously, if students have those needs, all of the online platform allows for easy accommodations for those to be able to have students receive what they best need in the different formats that they need them. This also ensures that we've got students with dyslexia or other learning disabilities, don't prevent them from doing well on STAAR. This has, by the way, never been the case. The accommodations have always been present, and the testing accommodations process is administered by staff. But this, as I didn't mention, is actually a saver for staff during the administration as well. If you have been involved in testing coordination on a campus level, you know that doing administrations for students with special needs often takes a large number of staff to be involved to be able to provide those individualized accommodations. Large adjustments can be made with regard to the ease in which the online assessment is creating those elements. STAAR Alternate 2, also just to be clear, is separate from this. So STAAR Alternate 2 being an assessment for students with the largest cognitive disabilities does not necessitate them being online. So those are things that still survive on paper and can continue forward in that same manner as needed. Those students receive whatever modality they best need to be able to be successful. We talked about the multiple ways. There's the online practice test, the interim assessments, and the TFAR assessments. These are all on texasassessment.gov. So if ever you want access to any of these resources, feel free to go check them out. And it's pretty easy to navigate. We're obviously very interested in folks' feedback for this too. So if you had feedback after you've used the tool or said, I tried to do this thing and it doesn't do it today, but I'd like that to do it tomorrow, please send us a message. We want to make this as useful as possible for folks such that they can really have great effect with it. This is something that is only as valuable as the people who are taking advantage of it. And that is the entire purpose of its creation. Finally, the move to online assessments. We talked about some of the benefits, but let me articulate these really clearly. So one is the access to accommodations that you saw in the video. 2 is kind of the faster turnaround on test scores and results. 3 is the improved operations that we saw with regard to the ease and lift. And then we've got now the ability to do the more online non-multiple choice questions, which are very difficult to do on paper. As you can imagine, you can't really drag and drop something on a piece of paper. But you have a great opportunity for greater interactivity and more similarity to those classroom exercises with the format. Feasibility study with regard to affordability for online. So this changed after COVID. So the feasibility study was done before COVID to say, do people have the equipment they need to be able to administer online assessments within their district? Then we spent $1 billion on one-to-one items and a lot of technology. And so this need has definitely decreased considerably given that time. That said, there is still a grant that folks can apply to that becomes available on the 18th. If it's so needed to be able to get get additional funding to be able to kind of do that last mile of investment. This is the data on assessments with regard to the increase in the percentage online. So you see here, there was 8.5 million tests in 2019. 2021, this went from 12% to 64% of students testing online. By the way, the 2021 tests, as you know, had some special circumstances, which is why the number of tests went down, but you can see still the massive increase in online. And then I mentioned to you 85% at the beginning of the presentation. That's for this most recent December administration that we just finished. So this is kind of how quickly folks are accommodated and moving to online with regard to that. This is the tool that is also available online, originally shared on November 2nd to talk about what system level prerequisites you need for the online administration, as well as what actions would come afterwards for a successful administration for folks who are not already online. Feel free to refer to that, and you can kind of communicate to the districts that that's available as a support. And then this is about the grant that we mentioned, which is kind of the last mile of technology investment. This posts today, actually, January 18th, should be posted online and available for folks who see the need to be able to apply for that. Okay, these are kind of the 5 components. One, again, building background, so the cross-curricular passages. 2, writing about what they need to with regard to text, evidence, and all our RLA tests. Open-ended formats, the new non-multiple choice questions cover those. Appropriate accommodations, you saw the video for how that's accommodated for, and then the online assessments. Last piece I'll cover is that over time, you saw some of the history of testing, and in that history of testing, what has happened is that usually when there is a new test announced, it becomes harder. And that any sort of changes to the test has equaled higher amounts of rigor, has equaled like a higher bar for performance. And there is no change with regard to this redesign from a difficulty perspective. So you might think, well, gosh, I took multiple choice. Multiple choice seems easier than having to do a non-multiple choice question. So therefore, the test would be harder. And that's actually not the case. We take a small number of items on each test, as I mentioned to you, that are field tested. So that is to say, here's the number of items that are field tested on any given test. Those items are tested for their data to see how students perform on them, ultimately, with regard to more difficult or less difficult items. They also then represent a variety of different kinds of student expectations. So the different student expectations would suggest, here's some that are part of this SE, here's some part of this SE. And then ultimately, they go into a STAAR test in a mix, right? Some of the questions are easier, some of the questions are more difficult. There's a variety of those different types of questions on any given test. Well, every year the questions are clearly different. And so given that they are different, what you do is you create a mix of those item types and a mix of those different difficulties to have the same level of difficulty for the STAAR test every year. And that has been true, by the way, since STAAR's inception, and continues to be true even under this redesign with the new item types. And with that measurement of difficulty being consistent, you actually get the redesign to ensure that we're not measuring some different level of rigor or some different level of student performance, but instead doing what is intended by the legislature, which is this alignment to the instructional experience and engagement by students in the new ways that they are in fact already demonstrating understanding in the classroom. So I go back to our original conversation about kind of death by multiple choice in a classroom as an instructional choice. That is not the instructional choice that should be made. And we know that in some cases that is happening, and we want to make sure that we do everything we can to not have that happen by ensuring that we increase the alignment as best as possible between the demonstrated knowledge that students are supposed to be able to gather in their process of learning and the ways that they can demonstrate that in some of the work here. Okay, last one is the involvement of educators. I mentioned this before, but this is a bit of a solicitation to please join us in the educator and item review. We welcome it. I'm getting kind of the time coming up, and my apologies, so I'll hit the last couple items here, but please visit the Texas Assessment Learning Management System to apply. We would love folks to be involved in the educator item review process. So if you know folks and say, gosh, I would love to look at the items, I'd like to be involved in choosing them, I'd like to be a contributor to that, please do. I invite you and would welcome your contribution to that exercise. This involves all the educator item reviews, but also involves range finding, which is the process of saying, this is the difference on a written assessment from like where a 1 becomes a 2 or where a 2 becomes a 3, and saying, here's where the cutoff is, and here's in my judgment as an educator where that information should be. Last slide for you. This is when the information is coming out. Later this month, you will receive examples posted to our website of the new item types and some practice materials. And then at the beginning of the month in February, we will also be at Midwinter with some more information and presenting in those locations too. So expect materials to be imminently released within just the next couple weeks so that you can be able to take them back, take a look. And if they're relevant for you now to be able to think about, great. If they're not relevant, because people have many other things going on in their lives and STAAR testing is not the top of your mind, and it shouldn't be right now, given the situation that schools are in the start of this particular semester, no worries. But the information will be available for folks to be able to take advantage of. And as you can see, new blueprints come out in the spring, the final in the summer, and then we'll have the full practice tests available in the fall for 22. Remember, this is for the spring of 22-23 school year. That with regard to these new elements. Okay? All right, I'm at time. I thank you guys so much for having me today, and hopefully this was informative to you.